Hey there, welcome to the Life and Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Tegan Travato, founder and CEO of Bright Arrow Coaching. In this show, we dive deep into how leaders like you can turn business challenges into personal growth opportunities. Whether you're a seasoned executive or an aspiring leader, this podcast is your go-to resource for unlocking your full potential in both your professional and personal life. Join me as we hear from executives, experts, and innovators about their leadership journeys and learn how to develop better strategies and activate them for success. So if you're ready to fuel your journey to becoming an extraordinary leader who makes a lasting impact, you're in the right place. Let's dive in. I'm excited about today's episode with Dr. Elizabeth Moran. Dr. Moran is a highly respected thought leader and author of the insightful new book, Forward, Leading Your Team Through Change. But she's more than just an academic. She is a down-to-earth, inspiring guide who knows how to help leaders tackle the complex world of organizational change. She has a unique way of combining neuroscience with practical leadership tools that make a real impact. Dr. Moran's approach to change management is incredibly practical. She breaks down for us complicated concepts into clear, manageable steps that even the busiest leader can use right away. Her background in neuroscience sheds light on why we often resist change. It's a normal, even expected part of the process. Dr. Moran's insights are not only rooted in her coaching practice, she also served in senior leadership roles in organizations like ADP, Bloomberg, Lehman Brothers, Getty Images, and Time Inc., and she has a master's and doctorate in clinical psychology. In our chat, we dig into some really thought-provoking topics like the balance between ego and self-awareness, the mental costs of adopting new behaviors, and why authenticity is essential in leadership. We also discuss how leaders today can navigate change effectively and how reframing setbacks can build resilience and emotional intelligence. Let's dive in. Here's Dr. Elizabeth Moran. Dr. Elizabeth Moran, thank you for joining us today and welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Tegan. So happy to be here.
Yeah, I am so pleased to help evangelize your book, Forward, Leading Your Team Through Change. So as someone who I've personally worked along the change lines inside of organizations, of course, we're both coaches, so we help humans and organizations change. So I was jazzed about this book and the amount of science that you backed real life scenarios and examples with. So I'm excited to talk with our listeners about this today. And, in the spirit of let's hit this thing on the head, there's a million change books out there. If I may say, most of them are so science that people can't really digest and apply them in my experience. So I'm curious what your experience was that inspired you to add to the list of books on this topic.
Yes. So I feel like there are amazing books on the topic. My challenge often was the actual operationalizing of the material. So when I was inside organizations, I never had met a leader who was able to do all of the things that Cotter and Stacking the Deck and many of the other proponents and people who've written books, people had a really hard time operationalizing it. So the concept in general of change management or change leadership, and I couldn't care less what people call it, I call it change leadership, was usually very overwhelming for people. So what inspired me was when I was inside organizations partnering with leaders, how do I take the best of the change management research and data and best action steps, titrate that down to the most essential. That was one. Two, then operationalize it. How do I put these actions in an order that a busy leader, potentially leading a large organization who's already time and resourced challenged, could actually implement? The other thing was the emotional side of change, which you dug into the neuroscience. And that's pretty powerful stuff. So whilst I like to consider myself someone who is open to the intuitive or the mystical and the emotional, I have quite a serious practical streak. And I found for me, the neuroscience has been life-changing. And then when I applied that to the change work, so many leaders who maybe they had an engineering brain or a finance brain, they were much more able to relate to the importance of the emotional side of change when I brought that in. The folks who are the HR or the traditional leadership and learning folks who are already more comfortable with the emotional side also loved it because it just confirmed a lot of their experience and intuition.
Wonderful. Yeah, as you mentioned Cotter and Stacking the Deck, those were the exact folks I was thinking of when I opened and said, there's so much science, but it feels like unattainable. And when I was reading your book, I just felt like, gosh, this is what's been missing. To hone in on a team's leader and say, you as this individual, this is your role, because so much of change science is written programmatically or enterprise level, right? So I think this was just a brilliant framing. And for our listeners to know, what would you say makes your approach more unique?
We mentioned one was everything that I do is grounded in the neuroscience, at least what we know now. And I try to keep that really simple. And here's the concept and here's what it means for you. That's one. Two, I was like, oh, please don't make me read another 300-page book. Please use a bullet point. So I did that to try to make things very clear about here's what you're going to get in this chapter. And let's just make it a very easy read. And then finally, I put myself in that leader's shoes. So the goal was no matter what your organization is doing from a change management perspective, and many organizations are doing pretty well with the project side of change. But where I found leaders really struggling was the emotional side and that awkwardness of coming against resistance and then just feeling really uncomfortable having those conversations. So what I was thinking of is if I was in their shoes, what would be most helpful? So I really articulate here that maybe the 4 toughest questions you're going to encounter as a leader when you're leading through change. And I provide scripts.
Yeah.
So here's how to answer that question. Here's the approach. Here's a turnaround conversation. Here's a celebration conversation with people. And I think people really like that as well.
Yeah. I love that every section that's action focused starts with a introspection first. So yeah, like all the things you mentioned, you gave them some ideas on how to work with others, but I appreciated the anchoring into the self first about each conversation that was ahead of them. So that leads us to the neuroscience. And I'm curious why you prioritize that in the book as early as you did and as much as you did when we focus so much on change across an organization and much of it is relationship oriented. But I appreciate that you chose a very clear path of neuroscience. Why was that? And before leaders read this book, what do you want them to know about the neuroscience component of change?
So when I started to really dig into the neuroscience, honestly, it was life-changing for me, both as a human and then as a practitioner. And so I think the most important thing is the brain is incredibly complex and we're learning so much about it. So this idea of, for me, what was so important was it explained. Why do humans react in very different ways and contradictory ways when it comes to change? And the neuroscience for me, it just explained a lot of these reactions and also I think gave credence to a lot of the frustrations that many leaders feel. It's like, okay, I'm the boss. I've told you we need to make this change. You can clearly see I'm trying to explain that if we don't make this change, we might not be successful. We're responding to market conditions. We are responding to our clients who are saying they're wanting something different from our products, whatever it is. And so why do so many humans then instantly
freeze up?
They freeze up, exactly. And they say no. So it was really understanding and helping to say to people. So you remember that old adage, which you've probably heard, is people view change as a threat. Guess what? It's true.
Neurologically, it's true, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's hardwired in. So what if that just became normal? So when I think about the book and the main concepts were, one, you're already a change expert leader. You're a human. You're here reading the book. Guess what? You've survived a ton of changes. So have your people. So let's use your expertise. Two, what if you treated resistance as normal? It's not a problem.
Yeah.
It simply is normal. So you don't need to get all stressed about it.
Yeah.
And then three, part of it was then using the neuroscience to help people understand why leveraging strengths and optimism was so important. So I think those are the things that really made a difference. Plus, bottom line, every time I spoke about it to leaders and in workshops, people loved it.
Yeah.
And so I think people were like, okay, it's me, but it's not just me. This is the brain. This is what's happening.
It's the human experience. We say at a really generic level, not neuroscientific enough, but we always say in coaching that, resistance is either sourced in fear, impatience, or ego.
Beautiful.
Yeah, it's nice and simplified that way. But security is what I think most of us feel concerned about during times of change. And that's a fear.
100%.
And when I think about what you just described, like this book is written for leaders of change. We are wired for change more than the average bear. We're also incentivized for change. And when you think about the people we're leading, they are not compensated for change most of the time. They're not incentivized for change, not the way leadership is. And so it is a true art then to be able to inspire people into a change experience, make them comfortable when they're not naturally motivated by the organization, for example, to want that for themselves. So there's such a systemic disconnect in all of that for me that's fascinating.
Yes. So I think I'm just going to slightly add or tweak what you've just said.
Please.
What I have discovered is that most people, whether you're a leader or an individual contributor at organizations, you want to have positive impact with the work that you do.
Absolutely.
You have clients that you care about. You have work that is fulfilling one hopes, and you want to make a difference. So what I ended up finding was it was less that people didn't want to do a good job, right?
Oh, sure.
Like they didn't want to try to contribute even if their organization was changing. What I discovered, what was so hard to humans was when it's not your idea.
Yeah.
So this was a thing coming out from foundation of organizational life, that this is usually leaders who are leading the organization will decide to make changes that most of us are tasked with implementing. And that's what I found was most of the struggle with people. So when leaders would traditionally announce a change, they would forget that they actually had the time to research the problem. They had the data and the information. And so they already decided to make the change. But when they announced to the organization the change, they forgot all of that.
Right.
And so what it was is helping people understand, how do you get somebody else's brain on board with your change? You don't have to write paragraphs and paragraphs about it, but part of it is convincing the brain of why we should change the way we do things, because the brain is an organ of efficiency. If it worked well this way in the past, it should work this way in the future. And so that, I think, was helping people understand why this is so important to get people on board with what you're trying to do.
Yes. And your point there reminds me of the Bridges transition model. Are you familiar with?
Oh, yes.
So for those of you listening who aren't familiar, I'm going to just be really layman's terms on all of this. But essentially, we experience change in a nonlinear fashion, and that we don't just move forward in our change experience. We may move forward and backwards and forward and backwards in our emotional experience of change. And the whole concept is that change happens fast. So to Elizabeth's point, leadership makes a decision. The change is there. The transition emotionally is slow, and adoption then, is correlated to the emotional transition. So it really makes me think about that. It also brings me to one of your points in the neuroscience chapter on the negativity bias. I feel like this is a great time to bring that up on the heels of what you and I just talked about. So I'd love if you would share with listeners at least a high-level snapshot of this concept.
There are two pieces to negativity bias. One of the pieces is we tend to give more weight to what we know, even if it's not working so well for us, then in terms of losing that, than what we could gain in the future, even if it's better, right? So that's, again, that sort of, if it worked well in the past, we're going to hold on to it. We feel more comfortable because, again, our brains hate uncertainty more than anything. So at least we know this, and now you're asking me to give this up. So that's one. The other piece is, as best as we can tell, is that our brains set us up for a negative outlook. And why is that? And again, I think most people will understand this, but this, in my coaching work that I do, and also as a human, this was probably the most life-changing thing for me. So our brains give at least 3 times more psychological weight to the negative. So that's negative experiences in the past. That's currently what's going on. And then we project into the future, especially if there's a change. The ego never goes back, or the brain. When I say ego, I'm not saying anything negative. The ego has a place. And the ego really should be coming out front and center when we are in a fight or flight situation. Unfortunately, if people don't have kind of that observing self, the ego is what rules the day. So somebody introduces a change to us that we did not decide on. We're instantly like, wait a second. Because we didn't decide on it, we don't have all the details. Instantly, it's a threat. And our brain starts to go to, oh my gosh, I can instantly pull up all the things that have gone bad in the past. I'm now maybe going to lose, to your point with bridges. Am I losing a sense of mastery or expertise over something I have? Am I losing a boss? Am I losing a team? Am I not doing the job that I wanted to do? I mean, whatever it is, it's all the what could go wrong. And that's hardwired in. That is always going to be that way. And that's a good thing. That keeps us safe. Unfortunately, if we don't have a way to check that, either with a very thoughtful leader or ourselves to say, you know what, I'm nervous. That's okay. I'm nervous. And just because I feel this way doesn't mean it's going to be a disaster. And so what I like to say to people is this is why communication is so important. Oftentimes, as a leader, you're going through the change yourself. So you might also be nervous. But your role is oftentimes to help course correct somebody's brain back to neutral. So what happens is in the negativity bias, we can kind of go along with that story that it's going to be bad. So then what tends to happen is the unknown, which is a future state, is technically neutral. But when we have the unknown becomes bad. And so part of the importance when it comes to negativity bias is talking to people to say, look, things are going to be challenging and maybe even it's uncomfortable now, but we don't know what the future holds. So we can work together to plan for that. But in essence, it's the unknown.
Yeah.
Which again, for many people is scary anyway. And so as a leader, you're trying to use what you know about negativity bias to back people up from that catastrophic thinking.
Right. Well, and manage their own while they're leading others. Because as a
Exactly.
leader, when I think, oh, my team is going to be so hurt and upset, that's a great story to connect to from a negativity bias standpoint, right?
Exactly.
So I feel like we need a moment of silence to respect consciousness. Modern humans have the hardest gig right now, and I don't think we give it enough credence. We're running around having very natural thoughts. Our ego is there to keep us alive. Many, many years ago, we would just do what it said, and we stayed alive as often as possible.
Yes.
Now, you slipped in the self that observes the self. You used a different phrase, but I call that consciousness, right? Generically speaking, our ability to observe what's happening within us is the hallmark of modern humanity. That's our consciousness. And so this like split life we live in our heads of my brain is making all this up to keep me alive and keep me safe. The part that observes my thoughts needs to limit my action on those things that aren't real. And it is exhausting work.
Exactly. You know, the other thing from a neuroscience perspective that I found fascinating when I heard about this study is so, yes, in our modern life, we are also bombarded with more negative, right? This was so powerful when I saw this study. So people who are cortically blind, that means at one point they were able to see, but then something happened, okay? They did studies with people who are cortically blind where they showed images of not nice things, let's say bad things, and they were watching what happened in people's brains. They were surprised that their brain was still firing unconsciously. Their brain was taking that in when it even never registered at the conscious level.
Oh, that's so fascinating.
Yeah. So if you think about that, this is why being very conscious about what you're taking in, because this is the miraculousness of humans and our brains. And really, as you said, keeping us alive is we are constantly scanning, and those types of inputs are impacting us, but they're not necessarily registering to our conscious brain.
Yeah.
which is when you understand what that means, it's incredibly powerful. Then the other thing you said was these leaders, they're going through it themselves. One of the myths that leaders have is they can't lead through a change if they're not 100% on board with it. And this is where I think as a coach, you understand this as well. One of the things we try to do is help people tap into their authenticity.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's a scary thing because it doesn't mean you don't need to be thoughtful about how sometimes that's communicated, and also be mindful of what type of culture are you in, and actually, is it safe and okay?
Right. Oh, what a great point.
But the authenticity, especially when you're leading a team, is very powerful. So to say something like, look, I'm a little concerned about this change too. I'm not sure it's great, but the organization is going in this way. So what I'd love us to do as best as we can is understand if we do foresee obstacles or reasons why this might not work, let's talk about it. And I'm happy to bring that forward. But this is the challenge in organizational life. Until your name is on the awning, part of that is we need to do what other people say. And to your point in the book, before I get into anything of communicating with your team, the chapter is start with yourself. So how are you feeling about the change? And maybe there's a change you can't get on board with. Then you need to decide, is this the right place for you? And sometimes the answer is no. I mean, that happened to me. That's happened to you in different points in our career.
Mm-hmm.
And that's okay. And also for a member of your team if they're not able to get on board. So while I say resistance is normal, it's not a permanent state.
That's right.
And so I have a conversation guide in the book. It's a real life example of someone who just could not get on board. But you can still treat somebody with dignity and respect and clarity and allow them to make a choice. And if that means leaving the organization, then that's what it means. And that's okay.
Wow. I want to play with that for a minute, because one of the things we often see in senior leadership is if there is misalignment when it comes to change, and there is a leader who feels they need to opt out, I watch them need to make the organization wrong on their way out, or make the CEO wrong on their way out, and vice versa. The team may need to make that executive wrong because they won't get in alignment. And I really appreciate you saying, like, we can lead change as executives and leaders without being fully bought in. If we have the emotional maturity and it isn't conflicting with our values, we can do that. And sometimes we really should. But it's okay for us to say this isn't right for us, and no one else has to be wrong for it.
Yes.
And that is such a new concept, I think, for senior leaders. And I'd love to see us all exercise that more, that we can leave with grace and not burn the house down on the way out, not bad talk people who do believe in the change, and expect the same kindness in return on our way out. We don't have any control over how others behave, but we certainly have control over our choices in that matter. But that is another example of managing our neuroscience, right, in the process.
Yes. And what you've just said, I mean, is just think about humans in general. Thinking about somebody that you love that you're no longer with. And many people, when there's a breakup, there's pain.
Absolutely.
And so I think oftentimes speaking negative is an expression of one's pain. But there is what they talk about, conscious uncoupling. And so whether that is from an organization, a leader, an experience, if you feel not happy about having to leave or not being on board with it, that's usually how it gets expressed. And so again, there is a level of maturity that I think it is better for everybody. And it doesn't mean that maybe you did get treated well, or maybe it's not the right decision. But again, that's organizational life.
Yes, it is. Humans in our systems, they're a very complicated mix. So
exactly.
We'll talk a bit with listeners about switch costs. That's another concept I found really interesting in your book on the neuroscience.
Yes. So one of my mentors is somebody named Dr. Srini Pillai, and I did a neurotransformational coaching certification with him, and he's just this amazing human. So he's a Harvard-trained psychiatrist. So I've learned a lot from him. So he brought this concept to my attention, but I just applied it more directly to change. So switch cost is this unconscious, again, so much of the stuff happens below the surface, part of our brain that is constantly calculating, is our effort to do something different worth the quote unquote cost, the switch cost of doing something different. So an example I use is you want to play an instrument, right? You have the fantasy of playing that and being on stage and, oh, that feels so good. And then you actually sit down and you start having to learn how to do it and the music. And at least for me, when I tried some of those things, I'm not necessarily gifted that way. So the cost wasn't worth it. I couldn't make the convincing thing. Well, it's same for a change, particularly, again, not somebody's idea. It's understanding first that you're asking them now to do something different that for them may have been working fine. And so how are you going to convince their brain that, let's just say, this dip in productivity that happens with every change is going to be okay? So you do that primarily for one, rewarding people for trying versus perfection. So you also could do it if it's somebody who has been skilled, they know about the change, walk them through or talk with them about, okay, you're going to be doing this differently. And how might you get this done? In other words, when there is switch cost, there's discomfort and there's more likely to be behavior change. So as a leader, you're helping somebody through that discomfort because it is uncomfortable. And most of the time when we have discomfort, this goes back to the threat part, our brain goes, ooh, 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 there's a problem. And what you're helping people do is say, no, I'm just pushing my edge or learning something new. So how wonderful to reward somebody for trying, even saying, hey, let's have a contest. Who tried and it didn't work? Whoever had the most spectacular, it didn't work, you win, right? So a lot of it is helping people play with this idea, knowing that, listen, it's going to be uncomfortable when you try this, but your discomfort is okay. If there's no discomfort, there's no behavior change.
If we move past the neuroscience piece before we go, if we were to focus our listeners on one part of their neuroscience or their behaviors that often come from that as a source, what single thing would you like to see them start with that would be most impactful? I feel like this is a tough question, by the way, maybe even unfair, but I'm curious if you have an initial gut thought there.
So one thing builds on this concept of what I call the negativity piece, is that our brains, because we give 3 times more psychological weight to the negative, that becomes a well-worn neural pathway. That well-worn neural pathway then becomes habit. People then confuse habit with reality. And that is very powerful. And so for me, it's optimism. It's practicing scanning for the good. At first, when people do that, it's going to feel weird. Choosing a more optimistic perspective starts to feel like, oh, that's fake. But when people start to understand that why is the negative view always the correct one? And guess what? If you were to go backward and remember all the things you thought were going to be so bad, some of them might have been painful, but usually it's not as bad as we thought. And oftentimes we get into a better place. So it really is practice as often as you can, celebrating and scanning for the good. It's going to feel awkward at first, but that will create much more peace over time.
Yeah. To your point, it builds a whole other muscle, neural pathway.
Yes.
For our clients who are big ruminators, I know I make that same suggestion where I'm like, that's fine. Let your brain run amok on how bad it's going to go.
Yes.
And then consciously choose to spend at least 30 seconds imagining it goes great.
Yes. You just said it perfectly, because now we have research that says the optimism is not just the feeling you get when something goes well. It is the fuel needed. You're putting something in the quantum field, however you want to frame it, that's something that could be a positive future state. But guess what? Now we know from a research perspective that positive vision is much more likely to happen. But you have to be able to imagine it first.
Right. And let's talk about the nervous system results for a sec, right?
Exactly.
So when I have clients pause and I'll say, okay, now retell that as if it goes perfectly. What do you feel in your body? They're like, oh, I just felt my body relax, or I just took that breath.
Yes.
So we know it has real physiological changes on us. Our thoughts do. And some of which we can really skew to our benefit and give ourselves peace.
Yes.
Even if it's 30 seconds of a nervous system break, which leaders will sometimes kill for in times of change, right? What a beautiful thing.
Exactly. And just remembering.
Yeah, well, there you go.
Remembering the beauty of that. Yes. And thank you for sharing that. You just explained it perfectly.
Thank you. Well, at this point, Elizabeth, is there anything else you'd want to share with our listeners? Any parting advice or thoughts as we're concluding our time together?
Yeah, so trust the wisdom of emotions and feelings. And so there's nothing wrong with feelings of concern. And usually if you have them as a leader, you use that to understand how your people may react. But so it's not about labeling something as bad. It's not about not feeling something. It is trusting the wisdom of you and your team, engaging in two-way conversation. And hopefully the book will give people more confidence, including the words to say when they are in one of those difficult conversations. So you don't have to have made it easy. You don't have to spend a lot of time, when you're already feeling uncomfortable trying to figure it out. You can lift and use and hopefully create a better conversation with you and your folks when emotions might run high.
Thank you. I just want to say for those of you listening, you have to get a copy of the book. And Dr. Moran, just big compliments to you for being able to take as much as you know about science, which is breathtaking, and distill it into something that's really reachable and applicable. I really appreciated how you modeled messaging in the book for leaders to be able to literally take a sentence that I would pay if every leader would use in an opening of a tough conversation. So you've just really handed us rich resources and sample language. And I want to thank you too for your partnership with Bright Arrow and working with clients together. It's just been such a pleasure. They've benefited so much from your expertise. So thank you for that. And listeners, if you need a speaker for your next event, Dr. Moran is where it's at. She brings this to audiences in a way that is energizing and intellectual, which most leaders want a mix of. So shameless, bias plug from my part. I can't help myself. So
thank you, Tegan.
Yeah. Thank you again for being with us today.
It's an honor. I look forward to our continued partnership. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
I hope Dr. Moran's insights gave you some valuable new perspectives to bring into your leadership journey. During our conversation, Dr. Moran covered some powerful topics: authentic leadership, why we resist change from a neurological standpoint, and how important it is to manage our nervous system responses. Her concept of switch costs and focus on positive thinking offer great ways to help us lead our teams through change while creating a space where growth and innovation can happen naturally. As leaders, we often face the tough job of guiding our organizations through challenging times, all while staying true to our values. And Dr. Moran's wisdom about valuing effort over perfection and being graceful during transitions reminds us that strength and compassion can go hand in hand. Whether you're in a boardroom discussing big strategic shifts or just having difficult conversations with your team, I hope her insights inspire you to lead with optimism and resilience. Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Life and Leadership Podcast. If you enjoyed our conversation, don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube Music, and share it with anyone who might benefit from it. We'll catch you on the next episode.